The wind across Kansas in 1887 didn't just blow. It screamed like something wild and wounded, tearing across the flat darkness with a fury that could strip paint from wood. Clara Whitmore bent low over the neck of her mare, urging the exhausted animal forward through mud that sucked at every hooffall. The fancy silk traveling dress her father had bought for the wedding hung in tatters, caught and torn by thorns and switchgrass until it looked like something pulled from a rag bin. She didn't care about the dress. She cared about putting distance between herself and the man who thought he owned her. Her hands gripped the reins so tight her fingers had gone numb, but not just from the cold. They were sticky with blood. Most of it was hers, scraped raw from climbing out her bedroom window and falling into the rose bushes below. But some of it belonged to the guard who had caught her by the stable door. His name was Reynolds. He had grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise, his fingers digging into her flesh like iron bands. His voice had been low and mean when he told her Mr. Garrett was going to be real disappointed to hear she tried to run. Clara hadn't screamed. She had simply pulled the iron fire poker from where she'd hidden it in the folds of her cloak and brought it down against the side of his head. The sound it made was like a ripe melon splitting open. He had dropped without making a sound. She had stared at the blood on her knuckles for maybe 3 seconds before she ran. That felt like days ago, but it had only been 4 hours, maybe 5. The adrenaline that had carried her through stealing the mare and racing into the darkness was long gone now, replaced by a hollow terror that vibrated in her bones and a cold that had settled so deep she wasn't sure she'd ever be warm again. The storm had broken half an hour back. Rain fell in sheets, icy and relentless, turning the prairie into a churning black sea. She was lost. The creek she'd been following, the one she'd hoped would lead her south toward Oklahoma territory, had vanished into the rising water in impenetrable dark. The mare stumbled, pitching forward, and Clara was thrown hard against the saddle horn. She cried out, a thin sound that the wind swallowed whole, and fought to keep the horse upright. "No, no, please," she whispered, patting the animal's soaked neck with her ruined hands. "Just a little longer. Just find us shelter." As if God himself had heard her desperate prayer, lightning split the sky wide open. For one stark white second, the whole world was visible. And there, not 500 yards distant, stood a shape, low and sagging, a dark block against the gray horizon. A barn. It looked abandoned, forgotten by whatever homestead had once stood nearby. But it was shelter. It was hope. She kicked the mare's ribs, and somehow the horse found one last reserve of strength. They moved through the sucking mud, the sound of wind howling over a broken roof growing louder with each step. The barn perched on a slight rise that had kept it from flooding, though the ground around it was more lake than land. Clara slid from the saddle and her legs buckled. She grabbed the stirrup to keep from falling, her whole body shaking so hard her teeth chattered. The mare nudged her with its soft nose, exhausted but loyal. Clara fumbled with the reins, her fingers clumsy and numb, and tied them loosely to a broken fence post. The barn door was missing, torn off and hanging from one hinge, leaving a gap wide enough for a man to walk through. She peered into the blackness beyond. It smelled of old hay, damp earth, and something animal. Something living. "Hello," she called, her voice thin and shaking. "Is anyone here?" Only the wind answered, whistling through gaps in the walls. She pulled her torn skirt close and stepped inside, out of the worst of the rain. The darkness was absolute. She moved forward slowly, shuffling with her hands stretched out, until her fingers brushed something dry and prickly. Hay. Old hay, but dry. She was just about to sink down into it, to finally give in to the exhaustion pulling at her like weights tied to her ankles when a sound stopped her cold. It was not the wind. It was not the rain drumming on the roof. It was the quiet, metallic click of a gun hammer being drawn back. Clara froze. Every muscle in her body locked tight. The sound seemed to echo in the small space, louder than thunder, louder than her hammering heart. "Don't take another step." The voice was low and rough, with no trace of mercy in it. It came from somewhere in the deeper darkness of the stalls. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't see him. All she could feel was the weight of that gun pointed at her from the shadows. "I don't have anything," she stammered, her voice cracking. "Please, I'm just looking for shelter from the storm." That's what they all say. The man's voice was tired, worn down. Who are you? Who's with you? No one, I'm alone. Lightning flashed again, freezing the scene like a photograph. He was there, not 20 feet away, half hidden behind a rotted support beam. Tall, dressed in a heavy wet duster, a soaked hat pulled low. All she could see was the glint of his eyes and the Marchand's steady barrel of the pistol pointed directly at her heart. She saw the gun. He saw her. He must have seen the ruined dress, the mud caked on her legs, the blood on her hands, the pure terror in her eyes. But his hand did not waver. The darkness crashed back in, heavier this time. Turn around, he commanded, slow, and leave. I can't, she whispered. All the fight was gone. The image of that gun, the memory of Reynolds crumpling, the hours of running. It all crested at once like a wave pulling her under. The storm, my horse, please. That ain't my problem. She tried to take a step back, to obey, but her body had nothing left to give. The cold, the hunger, the stark final terror of that gun barrel pointing at her chest. It broke something inside her. Her vision tunneled down to a single point of light, then went black. She didn't faint gracefully. Her knees just hit the dirt floor, and she pitched forward into the hay. The darkness inside her head finally matched the darkness of the barn, and somewhere in that darkness, she heard the man curse softly. Luke Garrett watched the woman fall, and he kept his gun steady for a full 10 seconds, listening hard. He heard the wind, he heard the rain, he heard the weak, shuddering gasp of the woman on the floor. He did not hear horses, he did not hear men, he did not hear a posse. He cursed low and long under his breath. This was trouble. This was the very last thing he needed. He was running his own race, staying ahead of his own demons, and a woman, especially a woman who looked like that, was an anchor he could not afford. He waited another full minute, the revolver still raised, his finger resting easy on the trigger. She didn't move. She just lay there in the hay, a heap of expensive torn silk and mud. Finally, he thumbed the hammer down. The click was soft this time, almost gentle. He slid the gun back into its worn holster and moved slowly across the dirt floor, his boots making no sound. He knelt beside her, checking the darkness around them on one more time before striking a match. The small flame flared, casting huge dancing shadows on the barn walls. Her face was pale as milk, smeared with dirt and streaked where rain had washed clean tracks through the grime. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was plastered to her cheeks. Her hands curled near her face were raw and scraped, the knuckles dark with dried blood. Not just her blood, he noted. There was too much of it, and some of it looked old. He frowned. This was complicated trouble. She moaned, a sound of pure misery, and shivered hard. Her lips had a blue tint to them. Luke sighed and looked toward the barn door, toward the storm still raging outside, and then back at her. He couldn't leave her. Even he wasn't that far gone. He moved to the corner where his saddlebags lay and pulled out a small cache of dry kindling wrapped in oilcloth. He worked with practiced efficiency, shaving slivers from a dry beam with his knife, striking another match and carefully nursing the tiny flame. It caught, smoke stinging his eyes, before the small fire took hold and cast a weak orange glow across the space. He looked at her again. She was still unconscious, or maybe just too exhausted to move. He retrieved his bedroll and pulled out the heavy wool blanket. It smelled of horse and old sweat, but it was dry. He tossed it over her without bothering to be gentle. She stirred at the contact, her eyes fluttering open. They were wide and terrified, finding his face in the firelight. She tried to scramble back, but she was too weak. Easy, he said, his voice flat. You're freezing. She just stared at him, her breathing shallow and fast like a cornered rabbit. He looked away first, uncomfortable under that gaze. He went back to his saddlebag and pulled out the last of his provisions. Half a loaf of bread, hard as a rock. He tossed it onto the hay beside her. It's all I got. Clara stared at the bread, then at the fire, then at him. He had taken off his hat. His hair was dark and shaggy, hanging past his collar. His face was angular, covered in several days' growth of rough beard. He was lean, but the breadth of his shoulders was evident even through the damp duster. His eyes were the color of slate, and they held no warmth at all. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and expected worse. She flinched when he moved, but he only went to the other side of the small fire. He sat on his bedroll with his back against a stall post and pulled his rifle from its scabbard. He began the methodical, calming ritual of cleaning it, pushing a greased patch through the barrel. His hands were deft and sure. The barn fell silent except for the hiss of rain, the howl of wind, and the crackle of the fire. The meager flames pushed back the worst of the chill, and the heavy blanket began to chase the deep cold from Clara's limbs. Her stomach cramped with hunger so sharp it was painful. She looked at the bread. Her hands were filthy. She rubbed them on her torn skirt, wincing as the rough fabric scraped her raw knuckles. She picked up the bread and tore at it with her teeth. It was dry and tasteless, but it was food. She ate slowly, painfully, forcing her throat to swallow. They sat in silence for a long time. The man never looked up from his rifle, but she knew he was aware of her every move. The tension was thick, a physical thing hanging in the air between them. She finished the bread. The small portion only served to sharpen her hunger, not satisfy it. She pulled the blanket tighter, the rough wool scratching her chin. "Who are you running from?" he asked quietly, still not looking up from the rifle's breech. Clara stiffened. She looked at the blood on her hands, dark in the firelight. "I'm not running from anyone." He stopped cleaning. He raised his eyes and they pinned her in place. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her, at the dress, at her hands, at the terror she knew must still be written all over her face. The silence was his answer. His silence said he didn't believe her for 1 second. She looked away, toward the flames. "I can't go back," she said, the words barely a whisper. "I just can't." He held her gaze for another long moment, then seemed to find whatever answer he was looking for. Or perhaps he just decided he didn't care. He nodded once, a short, sharp movement, and returned his attention to the rifle. The unspoken agreement settled between them like a truce. He wouldn't ask any more questions. She wouldn't be any more trouble than she had to be. The fire burned low. The man finished with his rifle, checked his pistol again, and then spread his bedroll on the opposite side of the barn, a good 15 feet away from here. He lay down using his saddle as a pillow and pulled his hat over his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing deepened, though Clara suspected he wasn't truly asleep. She stayed by the fire, soaking up the last of the warmth, but the kindling was gone, and the damp logs he'd found smoked more than they burned. The fire died, shrinking to a bed of pale red embers. The cold returned almost instantly. It swept in through the broken planks like a living thing, biting and relentless. The wind had not died down. It seemed to gain strength as the night deepened. Clara began to shiver. At first it was just a tremor, but as the minutes stretched into an hour, it became violent and uncontrollable. Her teeth chattered so loudly she was afraid it would wake him. She looked over at the man. He was a long, dark shape in the gloom, seemingly unaffected by the cold. He had the bedroll, and he was lying on a thick pile of hay, insulated from the frozen ground. She was on bare dirt. The cold was seeping up through the earth and into her bones. She tried to curl into a ball, pulling her knees to her chest, but it didn't help. The cold was relentless. It was more than uncomfortable now. It was becoming dangerous. She looked at the man again. He represented danger of a different kind. He had a gun and a hard face, and he had made it clear he wanted nothing to do with her. But he was warm. She debated for what felt like an eternity. Pride warred with survival. The memory of the gun warred with the agonizing, aching cold. The cold won. Slowly, trying to make no sound, Clara got to her hands and knees. The blanket trailed behind her. She crawled across the distance, separating them, her movements stiff, her whole body shaking. The hay rustled beneath her. She heard the man's breathing stop. He was awake. He was listening. She froze halfway there, terrified. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just lay there, perfectly still, under his hat. She waited. The wind howled, and a blast of icy air shot through the gap in the door, stinging her face. She shivered so hard her jaw ached. She had to move. She crawled the last few feet and stopped just shy of his bedroll, settling into the deep, loose hay beside him. She huddled there, pulling the blanket tight, still shaking. The small residual warmth from his body, trapped in the hay around him, was a blessing. It wasn't enough, but it was something. She lay there, miserable and cold, for several long minutes. He still hadn't moved. Then his voice came from the darkness, low and rough. "Get in the hay." "Not on it." She hesitated, then understood. She pushed aside the top layer of hay, burrowing into the drier, warmer straw beneath, pulling her wool blanket in with her. It was warmer here, insulated from the wind. She settled with her back to him, near his bedroll, but not touching. The shaking began to subside, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. She was still cold, but she knew she wouldn't freeze. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the storm and the breathing of the dangerous man beside her, and wondered if she had escaped one prison only to find herself in another. Clara woke to the smell of wood smoke and chicory coffee. It was a harsh, bitter smell, but it was warm and alive, and it pulled her up from the dreamless dark she'd fallen into. She was stiff, her body aching from the cold ground and the desperate ride, but the violent shivering was gone. She was buried in hay, the heavy wool blanket cocooning her like a chrysalis. She opened her eyes. The barn was gray with morning light, pale and thin. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that dripped. Rainwater ran in steady streams from a dozen holes in the roof, puddling on the dirt floor. The man, the stranger who had let her stay, was crouched by a small, efficient fire. A blackened tin pot perched on a rock at its edge, steam rising in the cool air. He was watching the pot, his expression unreadable. He had taken off his wet duster. He wore a faded flannel shirt now, the sleeves rolled up his forearms. He seemed to fill the small space with a quiet, coiled energy, like a spring wound too tight. He heard the rustle of her moving in the hay. He didn't look up, but his hand moved to the tin cup resting near his boot. He dipped it into the pot and pushed it across the dirt toward her. "It's coffee," he said, his voice rough from sleep. "It'll warm you." She pushed herself out of the hay, the blanket clutched around her shoulders. Her dress was a stiff, ruined mess of mud and torn silk. She felt the shame of her appearance wash over her, then pushed it down hard. Shame was a luxury she couldn't afford. She crawled toward the fire and took the cup. Her hands were still scraped raw, and the hot tin made her wince, but the heat was life itself. She sipped carefully. The coffee was scalding and black, so bitter it made her eyes water. It tasted of burnt grain and earth, but it was hot. It burned a path straight to her stomach, and she welcomed it like a benediction. He took his own cup and drank, staring into the flames. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the rhythmic dripping of rainwater. "You cried out in your sleep," he said, still not looking at her. Clara's hand tightened on the cup. She had no memory of it. "I don't remember." "You said a name, over and over." He paused. "Garrett." The blood drained from her face. She felt cold again, colder than she had in the storm. "And you were fighting," he added, his voice flat. "Who's Garrett?" She flinched, a small violent movement that sloshed coffee onto her hand. She barely felt the burn. "He's no one." Luke finally turned his head. His gray eyes settled on her, and she felt pinned like a butterfly on a board. He looked at her ruined hands, at the bruise forming on her cheek where Reynolds had grabbed her, at the terror that she knew must still be swimming in her eyes. He didn't believe her, but he didn't press. He just turned back to the fire, a small, hard line setting in his jaw. He had offered a chance for truth, and she had refused it. The wall between them was back, solid as stone. The morning wore on. The rain didn't stop, just settled into a cold, persistent drizzle. Luke went out to check on the horses, and Clara watched him through the broken door. His own horse, a lean, tough-looking buckskin, seemed fine. Her mare, however, was favoring its front left leg, limping slightly when it tried to move. Luke returned, his hat and duster soaked again. He shed them by the fire, water pooling around his boots. His shirt was damp, plastered to his chest and back. He muttered a curse under his breath and went to his saddlebag, pulling out a stained but dry shirt, the only other one he seemed to possess. He turned his back to her and pulled the wet shirt off over his head. Clara, who had been trying very hard to look anywhere else, found her gaze drawn to him despite herself. The firelight played over the skin of his back, the muscles shifting as he moved. He was lean but powerfully built, all rope and sinew, like a man who had spent his life working with his hands and his body. But his skin was a map of old violence. A puckered pale scar the size of a silver dollar sat high on his left shoulder blade. Another, a long, angry white line, slashed across his ribs on the right side. When he turned to toss the wet shirt aside, she saw his chest. It was worse. Two more round scars, clearly from bullets, were scattered across his torso. One was dangerously close to his heart. A jagged, starburst-shaped burn marked his lower abdomen. She had seen farmhands with scars from barbed wire or the kick of a mule. She had never seen this. This was the deliberate work of men, of guns and knives and fire. He caught her staring. His eyes narrowed, not in anger but in a kind of weary defensiveness. He didn't bother to cover himself. He just stood there, letting her look. "What?" he asked, his voice low. "You're back," she whispered, unable to look away. "What happened?" He picked up the dry shirt and looked at it, not at her. "Occupational hazards." "What occupation?" He gave a short, mirthless laugh. He pulled the clean shirt on, the fabric hiding the stories written on his skin. "I used to ride with a man named Elias Thorne," he said, sitting down and picking up his coffee cup. "We moved merchandise, rifles to miners, pistols to settlers, sometimes to folks who shouldn't have had them." He drank, his eyes distant. "It was good pay for a while, better than punching cattle for $30 a month." "You were in a gang," she said. It wasn't a question. "You could call it that. We called it a business." He fell silent for a moment, staring into the fire. "Thorne got greedy, decided he didn't like splitting the profits 5 ways. So he set us up. A buyer in the panhandle, supposed to be a big sale. It was an ambush." His jaw tightened. "Thorne and the buyer took the guns, took the money, and left me and 2 others for the buzzards. I was the only one who got out." He tapped the spot on his chest, the scar near his heart. "This one was from Thorne himself, a parting gift." He fell silent. The story finished. He was telling her, she realized, to warn her, to let her know exactly what kind of man she was trapped with in this barn. She was not a lady of quality, taking shelter with a gentleman. She was a fugitive, hiding with a killer. The revelation should have terrified her. Strangely, it did not. Instead, it settled a kind of grim understanding between them. They were both running. They were both hunted. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. He looked at her, surprised. "Don't be. I made my bed. I'm just trying not to die in it." A loud drip and a small splash near her foot made her jump. A new leak had sprung in the roof, directly over their small dry patch of hay. Another drop followed, then another, cold and insistent. Luke swore softly, looking up at the rotten rafters. "That's the last dry spot we got." He stood and surveyed the damage, then walked through the mud to the far stall. He returned with 2 long warped boards, clearly scavenged from some old repair job years ago. He looked up, judging the height. "I can't reach it from the ground," he said. "I'll have to climb." He wedged one board into the dirt, leaning it against the rotted support beam, and handed the other to Clara. "I'll get up there. You hand this to me when I'm set." Clara nodded, her hands tightening on the rough, damp wood. Luke climbed the side of the stall, his boots slipping on the wet wood. He moved carefully, testing each foothold before putting his weight on it. He reached the crossbeam and balanced there precariously, 12 feet above the floor. The old wood groaned under his weight. "All right," he called down, his voice tight with concentration. "Hand it up. Easy now." Clara lifted the heavy board. It was awkward, and she had to stretch onto her toes to get it high enough. He leaned down, his fingers straining to reach it. The beam he was standing on was slick with moss and rainwater. "A little higher," he said, grunting with effort. She pushed upward, rising onto her toes, her arms shaking from the weight. It happened fast. His boots slipped. She heard the sharp crack of wood, a muffled curse. He didn't fall clean. He twisted, trying to regain his balance. But his momentum was gone. He came crashing down, a tangle of long limbs and desperate grabbing, and slammed into her. The force of his weight drove every bit of air from her lungs. She screamed, and they both went down hard, tumbling into the largest, driest pile of hay. She landed on her spine, the hay cushioning the worst of the impact. But he landed on top of her. The world stopped. The barn was silent except for the dripping rain. All she could feel was him. He was heavy, solid muscle and bone, pressing her deep into the straw. His chest was hard against her own, and his breath was hot on her cheek. One of his legs was tangled between hers, the rough denim of his jeans abrasive against her torn dress. Her hands were trapped between them, pressed flat against the solid wall of his chest. She could feel his heart hammering, a fast, heavy beat against her palms. He had braced himself on his elbows, taking most of his weight off her, but he was still covering her, still touching her everywhere. She could smell him, rain and wet wool and coffee, and a faint masculine scent of sweat and leather. She stared up at him, her eyes wide. He was staring down at her, his face inches from hers. His gray eyes were no longer cold or flat. They were dark and intense, fixed on her mouth. Neither of them moved for what felt like 10 full seconds. It felt like an hour. The barn, the storm, the running. It all faded away, leaving only this man, this weight, this heat. Clara's heart, which she thought had stopped entirely, suddenly kicked hard. A wild, painful throb in her chest. A strange, terrifying warmth uncurled deep in her belly, spreading through her like spilled honey. Luke's breath hitched. He saw the shift in her expression, the flicker of something that was decidedly not fear. He broke the spell. He pushed himself off her in a single violent movement, rolling away and scrambling to his feet. He was breathing hard, his fists clenched at his sides. "I'm sorry," he bit out, the words harsh. "Are you hurt?" Clara sat up slowly, pulling hay from her hair. Her entire body was trembling, but not from fear. Not anymore. "No, I'm fine." She was not fine. She was confused and shaken, and her skin burned where he had touched her. She felt lightheaded, and the fear that returned was not of him, but of the feeling he had sparked. It was a feeling she had been taught was base and animal and wrong, and it was the first thing she had truly felt besides terror in months. Luke turned his back on her, running a hand through his damp hair. "We'll leave the damn roof," he said roughly. He walked to the far side of the barn, as far as he could get from her, and busied himself with his saddle, checking straps that didn't need checking. Clara wrapped her arms around her knees. She could still feel the imprint of his body on hers. She watched him, the straight, tense line of his back. He did not look at her again for the rest of the day, but she felt his eyes on her when he thought she wasn't looking. Quick, guarded glances, then away. Something had changed between them. Something had broken open that neither of them knew how to talk about. And outside, the rain kept falling. The day bled into a long, cold evening. The rain finally eased to a drizzle, but the temperature plummeted as the sun went down behind heavy clouds. The cold crept back into the barn, more potent than the night before. They built up the fire together, their movements stiff and awkward, careful not to brush hands or stand too close. The silence was heavier now, charged with the memory of the fall. When it was time to sleep, there was no discussion. There was one bedroll and one wool blanket, and to sleep apart was to freeze. Luke laid his bedroll near the fire and spread the blanket over it. He lay down on one side on the bare hay, leaving the thicker padding of the bedroll for her. He turned his back to the space she would occupy, making his intentions clear. Clara hesitated for a long time, but the cold was biting and insistent. She lay down on the bedroll with her back to his back. The space between them was only a few inches, but it felt like a canyon. She pulled a corner of the blanket over herself. He reached back, his hand brushing her shoulder briefly, and pulled the rest of the blanket over them both, tucking it in around her. His touch was impersonal and brief, but it sent a jolt through her like lightning. They lay like that, two straight, rigid lines in the dark, listening to the fire crackle and pop. The warmth of his body radiated across the small gap, heating her back. It was comforting, and it was agonizing. "This man," Clara said, her voice so low it was almost lost in the sound of rain on the roof. "The one you heard me name." Luke went very still. He did not turn. "Garrett is his name," she continued, speaking to the dancing shadows on the far wall. "My father owns a large tract of land in eastern Kansas, but he's in debt, deep in debt, to Mr. Garrett." She paused, the words sticking in her throat like broken glass. "Mr. Garrett is an old man, maybe 55, maybe 60. He's cold. He has buried 2 wives already." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He offered to forgive my father's debt, all of it, $10,000, in exchange for the land and for me. A marriage contract. I was part of the property being transferred. Well, Luke said nothing, but she felt him listening, really listening. I was to be married in 2 days. I'm not a person to them. I'm a deed, a way to settle a score. Her voice broke, the humiliation and rage rising like bile. I hit the guard. Reynolds, I think I may have killed him. And I ran because I cannot. I will not. She took a shuddering breath, the words tearing out of her like something living. I don't want to be property anymore. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and bleeding. She had never spoken it aloud before, never given voice to the full horror of what her father had done. She began to tremble, not from cold this time, but from the fear and shame and fury that had been building for weeks, ever since her father had told her about the arrangement with his cold smile and his empty eyes. She felt Luke shift behind her. He rolled onto his back, then slightly onto his side to face her. She kept her back to him, but she could feel his breath on her hair. She was so cold and so scared and so terribly, terribly alone. She wanted more than anything to turn around, to press her face into his chest, to feel the warmth of another living, breathing person who was not trying to buy or sell her. But she was terrified. The only touch she had ever known from a man, besides her father's distant pats on the head when she was a child, was Reynolds's bruising grip. Her fear of Garrett was a cold dread of the wedding night, of what would be taken from her without her consent. She was shaking now, and a new confusing feeling was mixed in with the terror. The memory of Luke's weight on her in the hay, the heat of him, the way his eyes had gone dark when he looked at her mouth. It was desire, but it was tangled so tightly with terror that she could not separate the two. Very slowly, testing this fragile safety between them, she turned to face him. In the dim firelight, his face was all shadows and angles. His eyes were watching her, patient and careful, waiting to see what she would do. The trembling became violent. She felt herself breaking apart, all the walls she had built crumbling like dry earth. She spoke from a place of deep trauma, a reflex of pain and a desperate, confused plea for gentleness. Please, she whispered, her voice shattered. Please be careful. I don't know. The words came out wrong, confused and frightened, speaking of violation and pain and being treated as an object. It was a shield and a test all at once. Luke's expression did not change. He did not flinch. He did not question her broken words. He simply watched her with eyes full of a strange, deep sorrow she did not understand. He saw her, not the words, but the raw animal fear beneath them. He did not move toward her. He did not try to touch her body. He waited a beat, letting the broken words hang in the air between them. And then very slowly he lifted his hand. It was calloused and rough from reins and ropes. He placed it gently against her face, his palm cupping her jaw, his thumb moving to stroke the damp hair back from her temple. The touch was so tender, so devoid of any demand or expectation, that it broke something inside her. A sob escaped her, silent and painful. He said nothing. He just held her face in his hand, his gaze steady, letting her know without words that he was not Garrett. He was not her father. He was not Reynolds. After a long moment, he drew his hand back carefully. He reached down and gripped the edge of the wool blanket. He pulled it up over her shoulder, over his own, tucking it tightly around them both, creating a small pocket of warmth. He settled back onto his back and she settled facing him. Their bodies were close now, sharing the same small space, but not pressing, not demanding. The shaking slowly subsided. The emotions were too big for the small barn, drowning them both in a profound, exhausted silence. They lay awake for a long time, breathing the same cold air, 2 feet from the fire, 2 inches from each other. And for the first time in her life, Clara felt something that resembled safety. Real safety. Not the false security of her father's house with its locked doors and armed guards. This was different. This was a man who had seen her fear and had chosen gentleness. She fell asleep with her hand resting near his on the hay between them, their fingers not quite touching. The light that woke them was gray and cold, filtered through the high, dirty cracks in the barn walls. The storm had finally broken, but the world outside was sodden and dripping. For a long moment, Clara didn't move. She was intensely aware of the man beside her. They had slept close, tucked under the single blanket, and at some point during the night their hands had found each other in the darkness. Luke was already stirring. He slid his hand away from hers carefully, as if trying not to wake her, and slipped out from under the blanket. The warmth went with him, and Clara felt the cold rush in to take its place. He stood and stretched his back with a quiet groan, then put his hat on. His movements were economical and practiced, the actions of a man used to waking in strange places and moving on quickly. He did not look at her as he went straight to the barn door to check on the horses. Clara sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. Her body ached in new places, and she felt the heavy weight of everything she had told him last night sitting on her chest like a stone. She had told him everything. She had told him things she had never even formed as complete thoughts in her own mind, and he had simply accepted it. He had offered his hand and his warmth and had asked for nothing in return. A low, worried whinny came from outside. She got to her feet, the stiff, muddy silk of her dress crackling like paper. She went to the door. Luke was standing with her mare, his hand running down the animal's front left leg. The horse was favoring it badly, refusing to put full weight on it. "She's lame," he said, his voice flat. He looked up at Clara, and his gaze was professional, distant. Last night might not have happened. We're not going anywhere on her today, maybe not tomorrow either. Clara's heart sank into her stomach. "Is it broken?" "No," he said, squatting down to feel the fetlock more carefully. The mare sighed, and he calmed it with a low rumbling word in a language Clara didn't recognize. "Looks like a bad sprain. She must have twisted it in the mud last night, in the dark." He stood up and looked at her squarely. "She needs it cleaned and wrapped, and she needs rest. At least 2 days, maybe 3. Clara came outside, ignoring the sucking mud that pulled at her ruined shoes. This was her fault. Her escape. Her responsibility. "What do we do?" He looked at her, then at his own buckskin, which was watching them with mild interest and seemed perfectly sound. "We wait, and I need to clean that leg. I'll need hot water and rags. Clean ones if you've got them." Rags. She looked down at her dress. It was already destroyed, torn and mud-caked beyond any hope of repair. She bunched the hem of her petticoat, the last clean white thing she owned, and pulled the small pocket knife she had taken from her father's desk. She began sawing at the fine linen, cutting it into long strips. Luke watched her for a moment, a flicker of something, respect maybe, crossing his face. Then he turned and went back in mud to heat water. When he returned with the steaming pot, she had a neat pile of white strips waiting. He nodded once. "Hold her head. Keep her calm." Clara went to the mare's head, stroking its soft nose and whispering to it in a low, steady voice. The horse was nervous, its eyes wide and showing white. Luke was surprisingly gentle. He dipped one of the linen strips into the steaming water, testing the heat against his own wrist, before pressing it to the swollen joint. The mare flinched, but Luke's hand was firm and steady, his voice a low, constant murmur. "Easy, girl. Easy now. That's it." They worked together in silence. Clara kept the horse steady, her voice the only sound besides the drip of water and Luke's quiet reassurances. Luke cleaned the mud and grit from the sprain with careful efficiency. Their hands brushed as she passed him a new cloth. His fingers were rough and calloused, scarred from years of hard work. But his touch on the animal was tender. She found herself watching his hands, the way he worked with a competence that was both reassuring and intimidating. When he was satisfied with the cleaning, he took a small tin of axle grease from his saddlebag. "It's not proper medicine," basically, he said, "but it'll keep the water out and protect it." He smeared a thick layer over the joint, then used the last of the linen strips to wrap it tightly, securing it with a careful knot. The job was done. The mare stood still, wary but no longer in obvious pain, the leg clean and bound. Luke stood up, wiping his greasy hands on his denim-clad thighs. He looked at Clara. Her hair was matted with hay and bits of straw. Her face was smudged with dirt, and the hem of her dress and petticoat were torn to ribbons, muddy and ruined beyond recognition. A small, strange sound escaped him. It was unrusty, as if the mechanism for making it hadn't been used in years. It was a laugh. "Well, he said, the corner of his mouth ticking upward just slightly. "You don't look much like a lady of property anymore." Clara looked down at herself. She was a complete mess. Mud caked her arms, and she was certain she smelled of wet horse and axle grease. She looked up at his rough beard and the dark, weary eyes that were, for the first time, softened with something other than pity or suspicion. A bubble of pure, hysterical lightness rose in her chest, unexpected and bright. She had survived the night. She was not in Garrett's house. She was standing in the mud with a wanted man, tending to a lame horse. And she was free. A small, breathy laugh escaped her lips. It was as rusty as his, unused and uncertain. Neither do you, cowboy. The moment hung in the air between them, fragile and bright like a soap bubble. They looked at each other, not as a fugitive and a killer, but just as two people who had found each other in a storm. Then the smiles faded slowly. The shared lightness evaporated as the reality of their situation returned, heavy and unavoidable. "We're out of coffee," he said, the wall sliding back into place between them. "And that bread is long gone. The horse can't be moved for at least a day, maybe two. I need to get supplies." Fear, cold and sharp, replaced the brief warmth. "Go where?" "There's a settlement a few miles east, just a crossroads with a general store. I saw the smoke from it yesterday afternoon before the storm hit." "You're leaving me here." The panic was stark in her voice, raw and unconcealed. He looked at her, his expression hard. "I'm coming back, but we can't stay here and starve. And that mare needs oats if she's going to heal proper." He turned and went to his saddle, pulling his rifle from the scabbard. He checked the load with practiced efficiency, then held it out to her. Clara stared at it. "Do you know how to use it?" he asked. "My father taught me to shoot bottles off fence posts, not people." "It's the same principle," he said flatly. "You point it at what you don't want to get near you, and you pull the trigger. There's a round in the chamber already. Don't touch this," he tapped the trigger guard, "unless you mean to use it." He paused, his eyes holding hers. "Barricade the door after I'm gone. Don't open it for anyone but me. Anyone, you understand?" She took the rifle. It was heavy, the wood smooth and worn, the metal cold against her hands. It was the first time in her entire life she had held the solid weight of her own defense. He holstered his pistol, pulled his hat low against the drizzle, and swung onto his buckskin with easy grace. "I'll be back in 2 hours, 3 at the most. Stay out of sight." He didn't look back. He nudged the horse into a trot and disappeared over the muddy rise, swallowed by the gray morning. Clara was alone. She dragged the broken stall door in front of the main opening, leaving just a gap wide enough to see through. She sat on a hay bale with the rifle across her knees and waited. Every gust of wind, every drip of water, every creak of the old barn made her heart leap into her throat. She waited, and she prayed he would come back. Luke rode with his head down and his duster pulled tight, trying to look like just another drifter passing through. The settlement was exactly as he had expected. A handful of false-fronted buildings sinking slowly into a sea of mud, a general store, a saloon, a livery stable, and not much else. A single horse was hitched outside the saloon, its head hanging low in the drizzle. He dismounted, tied his buckskin to the rail outside the general store, and pushed his way inside. It smelled of tobacco and burlap and aging cheese, the familiar scent of 100 such stores scattered across the territories. An old man with wire spectacles perched on his nose sat behind the counter, reading a week-old newspaper. "Help you?" the man asked, looking up. "Coffee," Luke said, keeping his voice low and his hat brim pulled down. "Bacon, oats for a horse, some hardtack and bandages, whatever you've got." The storekeeper nodded and shuffled off to collect the items, moving with the unhurried pace of a man who had nowhere else to be. Luke kept his back to the wall, his eyes on the street outside. He felt exposed here, vulnerable. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to get what he needed and get out. "That'll be $3.20, the storekeeper said, setting the wrapped parcels on the counter. Luke pulled the coins from his pocket, counting them out carefully onto the scarred wood. As he was gathering the supplies into his saddlebag, the door opened with a rusty squeal of hinges. A man slouched in. He was thin and greasy-looking, wearing a stained coat and a hat that had seen better days. His eyes were too close together, giving him a weaselly appearance. He was looking for tobacco, but he stopped when he saw Luke. He squinted, his rat-like eyes narrowing. "Say," the man said, his voice wheedling and nasal, "I know you." Luke froze. Every muscle in his body went tight. He didn't turn around. "You're mistaken." "No, I ain't," the man said, taking a step closer. He smelled of sour whiskey and unwashed clothes. "I'd know that face anywhere. You're Luke Garrett, the one who shot up Elias Thorne's crew out in the Panhandle." He grinned, showing rotten teeth. "I was in Dodge last year. Saw a poster. There's a reward on you. $500. The storekeeper's eyes went wide. He took a step back from the counter. Luke turned very slowly, his hand hovering near his pistol. "I said you were mistaken." "I ain't," the man insisted, his grin widening. $500. I reckon the marshal over in Hayes City would be real interested to know you're here." Luke moved fast as a striking snake. He grabbed the man by the front of his greasy coat and slammed him back hard against a barrel of pickles. The man's grin vanished instantly, replaced by raw fear. "You didn't see me," Luke snarled, his face inches from the man's. "I was never here. You say one word, you breathe one syllable about me, and I will come back. And you won't live to spend a single cent of that reward. Do you understand me?" The man, his eyes bulging, nodded frantically. Luke shoved him hard, sending him sprawling into a stack of flour sacks. He grabbed his supply, threw the money on the counter, and backed toward the door. He was untying his horse when the man came flying out of the store, not at Luke but screaming at the top of his lungs. "That's him! That's the one! There's a reward! $500! The saloon door burst open. Two men, ranchers by the look of them, came out with their hands on their pistols, squinting into the gray morning light. "Damn it," Luke breathed. He swung into the saddle just as one of the ranchers pulled his gun. A shot rang out, sharp and loud in the quiet morning. The bullet kicked up mud near his horse's hoof. "He's getting away!" Luke didn't look back. He kicked the buckskin hard, bending low over its neck as another shot whined past, going wide. He cleared the edge of the small settlement and disappeared into the tall grass of the prairie, his heart hammering with a cold, familiar fury. He was recognized. He was hunted. And he had just led them right back to Clara. Luke took a long, circular route back to the barn, hoping to throw off any immediate pursuit. He was angry at himself, at the weaselly man in the store, at the whole goddamn world. He was poison. He knew it. Everything he touched turned to ash and blood. He should have just kept riding. He should have left Clara in that barn with the rifle and supplies and never looked back. But even as he thought it, he knew he couldn't. Wouldn't. Clara heard the hoofbeats, and her heart seized in her chest. She raised the rifle with shaking hands and peered through the crack in the door. It was him. She dragged the stall door away as he rode straight into the barn, his horse lathered with sweat and breathing hard. He swung down, pulling the saddlebags with him, his movements jerky and violent. "We have to go," he said, his voice grim. "Now." "What happened?" "I was seen. Recognized." He was pulling the saddle from his horse with rough, angry movements. "There's a reward on my head, $500. Some bastard in the store knew my face. Are they coming?" "Not yet, but they will be." He threw the saddle onto a post. "They'll form a posse. It's what men do when there's money involved. They'll search every barn and outbuilding within 10 miles. It was then that Clara saw it. On his left shoulder, high up near the collar, his duster was dark and wet. It wasn't water, it was blood. "You're hurt," she whispered, stepping toward him. "You're bleeding." Luke glanced down as if just noticing. "It's nothing, a graze. One of them got off a lucky shot." "A shot?" Her voice came out thin and high. "They were shooting at you?" "It's nothing," he repeated, harsher this time, turning his back to her and busying himself with the supplies. He was hiding it, hiding how bad it was. He was lying to her. And the lie hurt worse than the truth would have. The fragile trust they had built, the shared laughter over the horse, the gentle touch in the dark. It all felt like it was evaporating, turned to mist by the reality crashing back in. Clara felt something harden in her chest, something that felt almost like anger. "How bad is it, really?" she demanded. "I said it's fine. Don't lie to me." He turned to look at her then, and his eyes were flat and cold, the wall back up, solid and high. "It doesn't matter. What matters is your horse. She still can't run." He walked over to check the mare. The animal was still limping badly, barely putting weight on the injured leg. "She can't run," he said again, his voice tight with a frustration that wasn't directed at Clara, but at the whole impossible situation. "Damn it, she can't run." "Then we can't run," Clara said. He slammed his fist against the barn wall, making her jump. "I can, you can't. They're not looking for you, they're looking for Mia." "You don't know that," she said, her voice shaking with that new cold anger. "Garrett will be looking for me by now. My father will have men everywhere. They'll have sent word to every town, every marshal. I'm just as wanted as you are." He stopped, his back to her. He hadn't considered that. He was so used to running his own race, fighting his own battles, that he had forgotten she was running one too. They were both trapped. Night fell cold and fast. The rain started again, a slow, miserable drizzle that felt like it would never stop. They were stuck in the barn, waiting for a posse that might come at any moment, with a lame horse and dwindling supplies. They ate the bacon Luke had bought, cooked over a low, smoky fire. The silence between them was thick and bitter, heavy with unspoken words. After they ate, Luke climbed the ladder to the hayloft, taking the single lantern with him. Clara thought he was checking the roof, or maybe just getting away from her in the weight of the situation. She sat by the dying fire with the rifle in her lap. She was terrified. Terrified of the men who might come. Terrified of Garrett finding her. Terrified of the future, which felt like a door closing slowly in the dark. But most of all, she was terrified of Luke leaving her behind. He was poison, he had said, but he was the only safety she had ever known. She couldn't stand it anymore. She couldn't just sit there and wait for the world to end. She stood up, her legs stiff from sitting. She left the rifle propped against the wall and climbed the ladder to the loft. He was not checking the roof. He was standing by the small square opening that served as a window, looking out over the dark, rain-swept prairie. The lantern sat on a hay bale beside him, casting him in flickering golden light. His back was to her. "You lied to me, she said. He stiffened, but did not turn. "It's not a graze," she continued. "It's a bullet wound." "It's a graze from a bullet. It just tore the skin. It's nothing." "Let me see it." "Clara, don't." "Let me see it." Her voice was sharp now, cutting through his protests. "Are you going to let it fester? Are you going to die of fever in this barn and leave me here alone?" His eyes flashed with something, anger maybe, but also resignation. He looked at her, at the stubborn set of her jaw, and saw that she was not going to back down. With a sigh that sounded like defeat, he unbuttoned the flannel shirt and shrugged it off his shoulders. Wincing as the fabric pulled at the wound, it was worse than a graze, much worse. The bullet had torn a shallow 4-inch groove along the top of his shoulder, just below the collarbone. It was bloody and raw, still weeping fresh blood. "Dear God," Clara whispered. She went to the supplies he had brought back and found the bandages in the small brown bottle of carbolic acid he had purchased. "This will hurt," she said quietly, uncorking the bottle. "I've had worse," he said, sitting down heavily on a hay bale. She cleaned the wound as gently as she could, but there was no gentle way to do it. The carbolic acid burned like liquid fire. He did not flinch, but his whole body went rigid, his hands clenching into white-knuckled fists on his knees. His skin was hot under her fingers, feverish. She worked quickly, her hands surprisingly steady. She cleaned away the dried blood, applied the stinging antiseptic, and then wrapped the clean white bandage tightly around his shoulder, tying it off with a careful knot. Her fingers brushed the warm skin of his chest as she worked. She felt the hard muscle beneath, the raised texture of old scars she had seen that morning. When she was done, her hands lingered on his shoulder for a moment longer than necessary. He was looking at her, his face only inches away in the lantern light. The flame-carved hollows under his cheekbones made his eyes look darker, more intense. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. She did not move. All the pent-up fear, the desperation, the strange, terrifying warmth she had felt when he fell on her in the hay. It all swelled in her chest like a wave building, ready to break. He was real. He was bleeding. He was here trying to protect her, even though it might kill him. And she was done being passive, done being saved, done waiting for someone else to decide her fate. "You are not poison," she whispered fiercely. Clara, he warned, his voice tight and strained. Get away from me. I'll only get you killed. No, she said. She put her hand on his uninjured shoulder, her fingers spreading over the warm skin. I'm not running from you. I'm not running anymore. She leaned in and kissed him. His lips were hard and unmoving at first. He was frozen. A coiled spring of denial and self-control wound so tight she could feel it vibrating through him. She pulled back just far enough to look him in the eyes. And then she kissed him again. This time she put her other hand on his chest, right over his heart, feeling it hammer against her palm like something wild trying to break free. She kissed him with all the desperation of her escape, with all the anger at Garrett and her father, with the stark, terrifying knowledge that this might be the only night they had. A low animal sound tore from his throat. His control shattered like glass. His good arms snaked around her waist, pulling her off her feet and into his lap with a desperate strength. His mouth came down on hers, no longer resisting. It was not a gentle kiss. It was raw and starving and fierce. It was a kiss of pain and fear and a desperate, agonizing need that had been building between them since that first moment in the dark barn. It tasted of coffee and gunpowder and the iron tang of his blood. He broke the kiss, his forehead pressed hard against hers, his breathing ragged and uneven. Don't, he gasped. Clara, you don't know what you're... I know exactly what I'm doing, she said, her voice shaking but fierce and sure. I am not property. I am not a child. And I am choosing. I'm choosing you. The moment hung between them like something fragile and precious, suspended in the lantern light. Luke was sitting on the hay bale, his back against a rough support beam. Clara was in his lap, her legs tangled with his, her hands still resting on his chest. He was afraid. She could see it in his eyes, in the tension in his jaw, afraid of hurting her, afraid of himself, afraid of taking something that wasn't freely given. Clara made the choice for both of them. Slowly, her hands trembling but her intent clear, she reached for the buttons of her ruined dress. He watched her, his eyes dark and intense in the firelight, his jaw tight with the effort of holding himself still. The dress fell away, pooling around her waist. She was left in her thin chemise, already torn and stained from days of hard travel. She moved then, shifting to straddle him properly, her knees sinking into the hay on either side of his hips. He sucked in a sharp breath, his hands coming up instinctively to grip her waist, his thumbs pressing into the soft skin above her hip bones. He was holding her, anchoring her, but he was letting her lead, letting her set the pace, letting her be in control. For the first time in her entire life, Clara was in control of her own body, her own choices, her own future. She leaned down, her hair falling forward like a curtain around their faces. Look at me, she whispered. He did, and she kissed him slowly this time. A deep, claiming kiss that said more than words ever could. He responded, his arm pulling her tight against him, his other hand tangling in her hair, holding her like she was the only solid thing in a world that was falling apart. It was fierce and desperate and clumsy. It was the frantic collision of two people who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The hay pricked her bare knees, the cold air raised goosebumps on her arms, but where their bodies touched, she was burning. There were no soft words, no declarations, only the harsh sound of their breathing, the rustle of hay, and the steady drumming of rain on the roof outside. It was a release, a rebellion, a desperate, passionate insistence that they were, in this one stolen moment, truly alive. When it was over, Clara did not move. She collapsed against his good shoulder, her face buried in the warm curve of his neck, her entire body shuddering with emotions too big to name. He held her, his arm locked around her like iron, his hand stroking her hair with infinite gentleness. He was breathing hard, his heart pounding against her chest where they were pressed together. He felt wetness on his neck and realized she was crying. Clara, he whispered, his voice thick with concern. Did I hurt you? Tell me. She pulled her head back, and he saw her face in the lantern light. It was slick with tears, yes, but her expression was not pain. She shook her head, unable to speak for a moment. What is it? He asked, his voice gentle now, all the hardness gone. No, she finally gasped, the word torn from somewhere deep inside her. You didn't hurt me. She wiped her face with a shaking hand, trying to find words for something she had never felt before. It's just, it's the first time, she whispered, looking at him with eyes that were raw and bright and full of wonder. The first time I wasn't property. The first time I was touched like I was a person. A real person. The first time I chose. The simple confession hit Luke harder than any bullet ever had. He had no words. Nothing adequate. Nothing that could possibly match the weight of what she had just given him. So he just pulled her close again, holding her tightly as she cried, letting her finally, truly break. There in the shadows of the hayloft, with the rain falling outside and danger circling like wolves in the darkness, they stayed like that for a long time. The lantern burned low, the flame guttering and smoking. Finally, her sobs quieted. She was limp against him, exhausted in every possible way. He kissed the top of her head, his lips pressing against her hair. "We leave at first light," he said quietly, his voice firm but gentle. "We have to. That posse will bust be here by noon tomorrow at the latest." She stirred in his arms. "But the mare, she'll have to walk. We'll go slow as we need to, but we have to move." He pushed her hair back from her face, his rough fingers surprisingly gentle. "I'll get you to safety, I promise. We'll cross into Colorado. They don't have paper on me there. We can lose ourselves in the mountains." He was promising her safety, promising her a future. Clara looked past him at the single square of gray light from the loft window. She was a ruined woman now by any measure of society, a fugitive from a forced marriage who had just given herself to a wanted man in a barn. He was an outlaw with a fresh bullet wound and a price on his head. She didn't believe for a second that people like them got happy endings. But as she curled against his warmth, listening to his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her ear, she allowed herself to hope. Just a little. They left the barn in the pre-dawn gray, a cold, wet mist clinging to the ground like something living. There were no words between them. The intimacy of the hayloft felt like a dream now, fragile and unreal in the harsh light of day. Luke moved with a stiff, painful economy of motion. His bandaged shoulder was a stark white patch against his dark shirt, visible even in the dim light. He saddled his buckskin with one-handed efficiency, then helped Clara onto her mare. The horse was still lame, but the sprain had eased enough that she could walk, albeit slowly. "She can't be pushed," Luke said, his voice low, his breath misting in the cold air. "We'll follow the creek bed west. It'll give us cover from anyone searching the main road. But we have to move as fast as we can." Clara nodded, her hands clenched tight on the reins. She had the rifle slung across her back now, its weight a constant reminder of the danger they were in. The first day was a portrait of misery. They kept to the low ground, the horse's hooves sucking in the mud with every step. The world was a flat gray expanse of wet grass and skeletal cottonwood trees, their bare branches reaching toward the sky like bones. Luke set a pace that was agonizing, just fast enough to make progress, but just slow enough to accommodate the injured mare. Clara's body, already sore from days in the saddle and the events of the night before, screamed in protest, but she did not complain. She watched Luke's back as he rode ahead of her, the way he sat slightly slumped, favoring his left side. She knew he was in pain, probably terrible pain, but he never said a word about it. That night, they did not risk a fire. They found a deep washout, a scar in the earth carved by some long-ago flood, and led the horses down into the darkness at its bottom. They ate cold bacon and stale hardtack, washing it down with metallic-tasting water from Luke's canteen. "You need to sleep," he said when they had finished the meager meal. "I'll take first watch." Clara wrapped herself in the single wool blanket and lay on the cold, hard ground. She fell into a tense, dreamless sleep, only to be woken 2 hours later by his hand on her shoulder. "Your turn," he whispered. She sat up, her heart pounding, disoriented in the darkness. "What do I do?" "You listen," he said. He handed her his revolver. Her hand instinctively recoiled from the cold metal, but she forced herself to take it. The weight was heavy and frightening in her palm. "Anything that sounds like more than one horse, you wake me. Anything that sounds like men talking, you wake me. Don't move. Don't make a sound. Just listen." She sat in the dark with the gun in her lap and listened. She heard the wind in the grass. She heard the sigh of the horses. She heard the quiet sound of Luke breathing in sleep beside her. She was terrified. But as the hours passed and nothing happened, the terror sharpened into something else, a state of raw, heightened awareness. She was protecting him. The realization settled over her, solid and real and oddly comforting. When the sky began to gray with the approach of dawn, he was already awake. He took the gun from her gently, his fingers brushing hers. You did good. They rode for 3 more days. The land began to change, the flat prairie of Kansas giving way to rolling hills, then to rougher, more broken country. They were approaching the border with Colorado territory. The hardship forged a new kind of silence between them. It was not the awkwardness of the barn or the charged tension after they had fallen together. It was the quiet understanding of shared survival. On the 3rd day, they had to cross a river. The water was high and fast from the recent storms, brown and churning with debris. It was Luke's buckskin that found the gravel bar, a shallow crossing that allowed them to ford without having to swim. But Clara's mare, already spooked and in pain, panicked in the middle of the current. The horse tried to turn back, its eyes rolling white with fear. The current caught it, threatening to sweep both horse and rider downstream. Luke grabbed the mare's bridle with his good arm, his muscles straining as he pulled both horses through the surging icy water. They emerged on the far bank soaked to the bone, their horses trembling with exhaustion and cold. They were in a thicket of pine and aspen now, the air thinner and colder. The mountains rose blue and purple in the distance. We need a fire, Luke said, his teeth chattering. His shoulder was soaked, the bandage dark with water and probably blood. We'll get sick if we don't. He set about gathering dry wood from under fallen logs, his movements slower than usual, more labored. Clara watched him, feeling useless and frustrated. Don't just stand there, he snapped, his voice tight with pain and cold. Help me. He showed her how to find the driest twigs, how to shave bark with his knife, how to build a small, careful structure that would catch and hold a spark. He pulled his flint and steel from his pouch. Here, he said, handing them to her. You do it. She tried, striking the steel against the flint, but the sparks were weak and died before they hit the tinder. Her hands were numb and clumsy. Not like that, he said, his patience wearing thin. He grabbed her hand, repositioning the steel in her grip. Hard and fast, angle it down. You're not asking it, you're telling it. She struck again. A spark caught. A tiny wisp of smoke curled up from the tinder, and then a small, bright orange flame. She stared at it, a fierce primal surge of triumph rising in her chest. She had made fire. She had created light and warmth from nothing but stone and will. Luke nodded once, something like approval in his eyes. Good. Now feed it slow. As they dried themselves by the weak, sputtering fire, Luke took the rifle from her saddle. That watch was one thing, he said. This is the other. You need to know how to use this proper. He spent an hour with her. He made her hold the rifle, feel its balance and weight. He showed her how to load the brass cartridges, how to work the lever action smoothly, how to sight down the barrel with both eyes open. It's going to kick, he warned. Hard. It'll feel like a mule kicked your shoulder. You let it happen. You don't fight it or it'll break your collarbone. You hold it tight to your body so you and the gun move as one. He set a pine cone on a stump 50 yards away. Aim small, Miss Small. Don't pull the trigger. Squeeze it slow, like you're squeezing water from a rag. She raised the rifle. It was so heavy her arms trembled with the effort of holding it steady. She lined up the sights, held her breath the way he had showed her, and squeezed. The explosion was deafening. The kick was a physical blow, slamming her back a step and nearly knocking her over. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt 10 feet to the left of the target. He said simply. She loaded. She fired. This time she was ready for the kick, braced for it. The shot was closer, but still missed. Gin. She fired 5 times. On the 5th shot, the pine cone vanished in a puff of bark and pine needles. She lowered the rifle, her shoulder aching and her ears ringing. She looked at him. A slow smile touched the corner of his mouth, softening the hard lines of his face. Not bad, he said. Not bad at all. The trust between them was no longer fragile or uncertain. It was physical now, built of shared watches and river crossings, of fire and gunpowder and small victories. He had stopped treating her like a delicate lady who needed protecting. She had stopped acting like one. She was a woman who could make fire and hit a target. A woman who could stand watch in the dark with a gun in her hands. She was becoming something new, something harder and stronger than the frightened girl who had run from her father's house. On the fifth day, they came upon a town. The town was barely more than a crossroads, a livery stable, a general store, and a two-story hotel with a fading sign. Luke's shoulder was inflamed, the bandage dark with seepage. He swayed in the saddle as they rode down the main street. "We need a roof," he said quietly. "Just one night. I need to clean this wound proper." "Is it safe?" Clara asked. "It's Colorado. The warrant is Kansas paper, but we need a story." He looked at her ruined dress, her tangled hair. "We're married, just married, running from your family. Let me talk." And the hotel clerk was thin and disapproving, his eyes lingering on Clara's disheveled appearance with obvious distaste. "A room," Luke said, his voice flat, "for me and my wife." The clerk's lip curled. "We don't rent to travelers of your sort." Luke moved fast, grabbing the man by his shirt and pulling him halfway over the desk. "We need a room. Now." The clerk's face went pale. "Yes, sir. Room 4, top of the stairs, 50 cents. The room was small but clean, with a narrow brass bed and a washstand. Luke left to get food and supplies, leaving Clara alone. In the corner sat a battered trunk. Curiosity made her open it. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue, was a simple white cotton wedding dress with a plain veil. Clara stared at it, her hands trembling. Another wedding dress, another chain. When Luke returned with food and whiskey, he saw her face, saw the dress. "It's just cloth," he said quietly. Then he walked to the window and looked out at the darkening street. "Tomorrow we need new clothes for you. Can't ride in that." He gestured at her ruined dress. "We'll have to go to the general store. They'll see us." He turned to face her. "When they look at you tomorrow, what do you want them to see? A fugitive in rags? Or a new bride traveling with her husband?" He picked up the dress. "They're looking for a runaway girl, not a married woman. It's a disguise, Clara, a way to hide." She took the dress from him, understanding slowly dawning. It was armor, a mask. While he cleaned his wound, wincing as whiskey burned the raw flesh, she changed. She washed away days of dirt and put on the simple white dress. It fit almost perfectly. When he turned around, he stopped and stared. "It works," he said, his voice rough. They ate in silence, the tension of the town pressing down on them. After the meal, Luke went to the window and stood there watching. Clara saw what he was watching. A man stood across the street in shadow, smoking, not looking directly at the hotel, but watching nonetheless. "Luke," she whispered, "I see him." She moved to the window. When the man turned, light caught his face. The blood drained from Clara's body. "I know him," she said, her voice hollow. "His name is Abernathy. He works for Garrett, for my father." Luke didn't move. "He's seen you when we rode in. He'll tell Garrett where we are. He'll telegraph tonight or pay a rider. Garrett will know by morning." Luke pulled the curtain closed. He looked at her, saw the terror in her face. "We have tonight," he said quietly. "One night of safety, one night in a real bed. Then we run again." The words hung between them like smoke. One night. Tomorrow they could be caught. Tomorrow they could be dead. Clara looked at him in the lamplight, at the pain etched in his face, at the bandage on his shoulder. "We have tonight," she repeated softly. And for that one stolen night, they held each other in the narrow bed and pretended the world outside didn't exist. Morning came too soon, gray and cold. They dressed in silence, preparing for whatever would come. They left the hotel at first light. The street was nearly empty, just a blacksmith at his forge. They walked to the general store, moving together like two parts of a whole. Inside, the storekeeper raised his eyebrows at Clara's white dress but said nothing. She was examining canvas trousers when the sound of horses filled the street. Many horses, moving fast. Luke went still near the door. "Stay here," he whispered. 3 riders stopped outside. One was Abernathy. 2 were hired gunmen, and the man in the center, dismounting in his fine black coat, made Clara's blood freeze. Garrett. He saw her through the window, saw the white dress. His face contorted with rage. "Clara!" he roared. But Abernathy called from the saloon across the street. "The killer's in here, Mr. Garrett." Garrett turned away from the store, heading for the saloon with his gunman. "We're leaving," Luke said, grabbing Clara's arm. "Now." They stepped onto the boardwalk. The street went quiet. "There he is," Abernathy shouted, pointing. Garrett stepped onto the saloon porch, holding up a paper. "That man is Luke Garrett, a wanted murderer, $500 reward. He kidnapped this woman, my betrothed." The saloon owner came out with a shotgun. "This ain't Kansas, mister. We don't like bounty men here." "I have a warrant," Garrett shouted. "Maybe so," the owner said. "But I see 3 armed men against 1 man and his wife. Seems like poor odds." Garrett's face darkened. "That is Clara Whitmore. She is my wife by legal contract. He stole my property." The word hung in the air. Property. Something broke inside Clara. She dropped Luke's hand and stepped forward into the empty street. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said, her voice shaking but growing stronger. "And I am not his property." "Clara, be silent," Garrett commanded. "No!" She looked at the watching townspeople. "My father sold me to this man to settle a debt. $10,000. I was part of the deal. Like a horse or a piece of land." The street was dead silent. "So I ran," Clara continued, "because I would rather die than be owned." She looked at Luke. "This man saved my life. He's the only person who ever saw me as human. I'm with him by choice, and you will not take me from him." Garrett trembled with rage. He strode forward and slapped her hard across the face. The sound cracked like a gunshot. She fell to the mud. Luke moved like lightning. He grabbed Garrett by his coat and threw him backward. Garrett landed hard in the mud. "You don't touch her," Luke said, his voice deadly quiet. "Kill him!" Garrett screamed, drawing his pistol. The street erupted. Gunmen drew. Luke dove behind a water trough, pulling Clara with him. Bullets flew. A gunman fell, shot by Luke. Another went down, hit by a miner. In seconds, it was over. Garrett's men were beaten. "It's finished," Luke called out. "Leave, Garrett." But Garrett, covered in mud and mad with rage, raised his pistol. "Damn you to hell!" He fired. The bullet struck Luke's already wounded shoulder, shattering bone. Luke spun and fell, his gun flying from his hand. Garrett walked forward, smiling, raising his pistol for the kill shot. This is what happens to thieves. Luke, dying on his back, fumbled with his left hand for his backup gun. He pulled it, shaking, unable to aim properly. He fired. Garrett stopped, looking down at the blood spreading across his chest. He fell face first into the mud, dead. Clara ran to Luke, cradling his head in her lap as rain began to fall. His blood mixed with mud and water, staining her white dress red. "No," she sobbed. "Please don't leave me." "You promised." The world went gray around her as someone shouted for the doctor. Luke woke to the smell of clean linen and herbs. His shoulder was a universe of pain. He was in a real bed, and Clara was asleep in a chair beside him, her hand near his. She looked exhausted, pale with dark circles under her eyes. When he tried to move, the pain made him groan. Her head snapped up. "Luke," she breathed, tears filling her eyes. "You're awake." She gave him water, her hands gentle. "We're safe. You've been unconscious for 7 days. The town helped us. They believed me." "Garrett? Dead. You killed him." She said it without emotion, just fact. He tried to lift his right arm. Nothing happened. Panic seized him. "The bullet shattered the bone," Clara said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "The doctor saved your life, but your arm will never be the same. You won't be fast enough to be a gunman again." His gun hand, his identity, gone. "It doesn't matter," Clara said fiercely, gripping his good hand. "You're alive. That's all that matters." Sheriff Brody came later. He was fair and thoughtful, taking Luke's statement about everything. "The Kansas warrant is real," Brody said, "but I don't care about Kansas problems. What happened here was self-defense. You're a free man, Mr. Garrett. You and your wife are welcome to stay." Free. The word felt impossible. Recovery was slow. Luke learned to use his left hand for everything. Clara was there every day, patient and steady, teaching him, feeding him, helping him heal. When he could finally walk, she led him up a hill behind town to a small clearing. A derelict cabin stood there, abandoned but salvageable. The view overlooked the entire valley, mountains rising blue and purple beyond. "The land is unclaimed," Clara said, her eyes shining. "We could file for it, build something here, a real home." Luke looked at his ruined arm. "I'm half a man now." "Then I'll be your other half," she said. "We'll do it together." They bought the claim for $10, spent the rest on supplies: a stove, window glass, a bed, tools, seeds, chickens, and a cow. The work was brutal. Luke was clumsy with one good arm, frustrated and exhausted, but Clara was his right hand, holding boards, climbing the roof, mixing mud for chinking. They worked from sunrise to sunset, building a life one nail at a time. Winter came. By then the cabin had a roof, windows, and a warm fire. Clara planted flowers, learned to bake bread, made curtains from flour sacks. She turned the cabin into a home. One evening she sat on their small porch with the white wedding dress in her lap. She had washed it clean, but his blood had left permanent, rust-colored stains. "I thought about burning it," she said. "It reminds me of that day." "It's not his dress," Luke said, sitting beside her, bro. "That's the dress you wore when you chose freedom. When you stood in that street and told the truth." She understood then. She folded it carefully and put it in a wooden chest he'd made. A keepsake of courage, not captivity. That winter, deep in the heart of the cold season with snow falling soft outside, Luke reached across their table and took her hand. "I've been thinking about that first night in the barn," he said quietly. "About your fear. You were testing whether you could trust me, whether you had power over your own choices." He squeezed her hand gently. "Everything that came after, every choice you made, that was you saying yes. Not because you had to, but because you wanted to." Clara felt tears, good clean tears. "I'm staying," she whispered. "Forever." "So am I," he said, smiling. Outside, snow covered everything, making the world new. Inside, by the fire, two people who had run their whole lives finally stopped. They had found freedom. They had found safety. They had found each other. They had found home.